Hello my dear friends, how are you? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. I'm Mari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about a delicate subject which is concerning goddesses of miscarriage. This was a question posed by one of my patrons 2 years ago, and since then there's been some discussion over this subject, so I thought it would hopefully be useful to make a video concerning this subject as to reach more people who are trying to find information concerning, well, this very subject. The question was actually concerning European goddesses of miscarriage, so the discussion has been rather European-centered, but I've looked into other cultures across the globe. So let me be perfectly clear here. There isn't much to find concerning this specific topic, but that doesn't mean there aren't goddesses or some feminine entities related to miscarriage. It's an unfortunate event that has clearly been very hard to deal with in the long span of time among various human populations. So it has certainly left some marks on certain religious approaches to the divine, but also in relation to certain supernatural entities. But we shall get to it further ahead. Before we start, I should like to express a few words. For those of you who have been in this channel for quite some time, you already know I always have something to say before delving into the main subject. So if you allow me, and I'll try to be as brief as possible, let me share with you a couple of words. Thank you. This is a sort of disclaimer. This is a very delicate subject to some, so if you are sensitive to these subjects, I advise you not to watch this video. I know some of you came to this video seeking answers to your doubts and fears, seeking words to soothe your heart and mind, to appease your spirits, to find peace, to find answers in a relentless pursuit, searching for something that may help you to cope with your pain, sorrow, and the unspeakable sickness rooted within your chest and staining your very spirit, caused by the terrible suffering and anguish of having lost everything you hope to have with the coming of a new life that you profoundly desired to bring forth into the world. I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear, and even though my next words throughout this video may give you some hope, do not cling to any expectations constructed by your desires before you come with me into today's journey until the very end of this video. I want you to know that I'm not here pretending to know what it feels like to carry life inside us, desiring that life, having hopes and dreams, and then everything completely shattered and snuffed out forever. I'm not here pretending to know what it's like to have life growing and developing inside us, and I cannot possibly feel within me such anguish and sorrow experienced by those who had life growing inside them and then all was taken away. I can only tell you that each person experiences things differently, and that I personally have experienced the many feelings that emerge when we are expecting a life to come forth into the world, part of our creation, part of ourselves, and the love for something that is on the way but isn't yet here, and then everything is gone. What I'm trying to tell you is that I can't possibly know what it feels like to have life growing inside and then it is destroyed and taken away. I only know what it feels like from the exterior, from a helpless and powerful position, from the point of view of a man who is waiting for his future child to come forth and never came. To have all the plans and dreams and desires for such a new life and everything abruptly taken away forever. I'm certain you understand what I mean by this. I know many of you care about me, so do not worry, I'm alright. I've had my fears and doubts, I have had many questions, and I have found my peace with it, and life moves on. This channel was never about me, so It won't start to be now. We all deal with things differently. I just wanted you to know that I'm not entirely ignorant to the pain. Children represent hope, children represent the future, so let us take care of those who have made it and honor those who haven't in our own ways, but never forgetting to live and appreciate the life that is still among us. Speaking of children and children representing hope for the future, I also want to speak of something that has greatly troubled me of late. The case of murdered indigenous children of British Columbia in Canada and their bodies found in residential schools. This is something that has shocked me, and I'm deeply disturbed and depressed by it. I cannot even imagine what the indigenous communities have felt and still feel about this. This is something I wasn't aware of, and only by pure chance I have come to know this, because I was precisely talking with a native indigenous person from British Columbia who follows my work, and just 2 weeks before the bodies were found or started to be found, this person was telling me about the terrible experiences in such residential schools and the lost friends that were never found. And 2 weeks after this person shared with me such terrible experiences from childhood, the bodies of children started to be found. This is something quite recent, something that has happened in the mid-20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, not so long ago. And some of those responsible for such monstrosities are still alive. I didn't know about this, and it makes me wonder the amount of horrible things happening right now that we don't know about, and in the future we may know, but already too late. And real people have suffered and died in silence, and there was nothing the world could have done, because many people in the world didn't know it was happening even during their lifetime. This makes me feel powerless. It makes me feel terribly depressed, but also angry, because there's something we can still do, and it is bringing to justice these murderers that are still alive and abroad, trying to escape justice, trying to escape their crimes against humanity, because this is a crime against humanity. This is a crime against life. There hasn't been enough coverage on the news concerning this terrible event. In fact, in Europe, there's little to no talk about it. In my own country, it isn't on the news, never was, still isn't, and no one is talking about it. And if this indigenous person, friend of mine, never said a thing, I would never have known. So the thing I'm asking is that, please, don't let this be forgotten, especially for us Europeans whose media isn't covering this at all. Let other people know of this, help to bring justice. Even if we don't have much power to do something, we can still share this event and let people know of these horrors. Put yourself in other people's shoes, within their skin, and try to think of the pain and sorrow and the injustice that has fallen upon them. Forced to be oppressed by a system that they never asked for, that is killing their children, stealing away their hope, their dreams, their entire future. It's children we are talking about, blameless, innocent. Ask yourself, is there ever peace without justice? Don't let this be forgotten, please. The bodies of these indigenous children are still being found. The numbers keep rising. More children are being found. Over 150,000 indigenous children taken from their home. Over 139 residential schools in Canada and many more in the US. And by the time I am recording this video, the number of children's bodies are close to 5,500. So by the time this video came out, and by the time you are watching, many more children have been found. These are children, murdered children. If there's no justice for this, there's no justice at all. if this goes unpunishable, if this is simply forgotten, and if these children have their voices shut out forever, then anything can be possible and many more innocent will die. It may be too late for these children, but it isn't too late to honor their memory. And it isn't too late for their families and for those who still live and for those who come after. Let us protect our children. These are our children. They may be from a different part of the planet, but they are from this world. And we are all of this world, are we not? So these are our children. Don't let this be forgotten, and let us try to bring to justice the monsters that did this. Because this wasn't something that just reached the limits of evil, but in fact it went beyond into the realms of monstrosity. Anyone who is capable of murdering the innocent, especially children, is capable of anything, and such monsters are a cancer upon this world. Think about this at least, please. Thank you. Let's start our today's video. As I said before, miscarriage has clearly been a very hard misfortune to deal with in the long span of time among various human populations. The problem in finding out goddesses related to this issue is that depictions of human religions and belief systems are quite recent in the long history of humanity. And much of the surviving mythologies, especially in written sources, are even more recent and come from patriarchal systems that have been repressing women's societies and beliefs for a very long time. Also, societies in which patriarchal systems are less profound or indeed inexistent are usually societies that have been greatly repressed by the patriarchal system of colonialism, which has had a great negative impact on several native peoples, not to mention genocide and displacement of populations and several other social, religious and political factors that has destroyed much of ancestral knowledge and belief systems. But also the daily aspects of life and all that it encompasses that is usually reflected in myths and folklore. But with the changing of mentalities and changes within the social structure of various populations due to religious canons that alter much on how people perceive and interact with the world, many things tend to be put aside and forgotten. And of course, the most powerful and widespread religions of the world are also patriarchal religions, in which the feminine is seldom represented, and when represented it is often highly derogatory. But even in such religions we can still find traces of ancient belief systems and how certain feminine figures and goddesses have been replaced, which still show us some traces of ancient beliefs that are crucial to understand the histories before the arrival of oppressive, intolerant and overall tyrannical religions. One of the first problems we face is precisely replacing animistic worldviews with world-denying religious views. As I've explained on other videos, world-denying religious views and precisely belief systems whose entire basis is to find life elsewhere out of this world upon death, the world is placed behind as merely a momentary reality. The religious aim of world-denying views is to lead a life full of restrictions that prevents the person from truly living in this world in order to follow the parameters required to live an eternal life elsewhere out of this world. So, the everyday realities of the human populations, the struggles, wishes, the joys and sorrows are often neglected and play little role within such world-denying religious views. Therefore, much of mythologies and belief systems that follow such lines of thought will not show us much on how life was understood and lived, but rather how death was explained, and death and prospects of life after death became the very basis of such religions. And so we have more about the reality of the afterlife, rather than the reality of the living. This is the opposite of what happens in most indigenous societies and within animistic worldviews, which are often world-accepting views, meaning life and death are part of the same, and the reality of our daily lives is a projection of the reality after death. So much of what we do in life will be a reflection of what we do in death, as we continue to live on after death among the community of the living. Even though some animistic indigenous societies also have clear realities of or for the dead and underworld and afterlife conceptions and places, they never stray far from the reality of the living. The point here is that within animistic beliefs and world-accepting views, myth has always been closely related to the daily life. The daily affairs of the human community and the constant contact with the world and life has always had a great impact on such peoples who live by world-accepting views, who live by belief systems that never put the human person outside or apart from the natural world and aiming to live a life in order to have access to an afterlife place after death, but rather the human person always inserted within the natural world and within all life. And weather phenomenon, natural disasters, animals, landscape features, the activities of living beings, the daily problems, joys, sorrows, misfortunes, blessings and happy moments of everyday life will have real impact on real people, which is why in the myths of such populations we will find deities and spirits of every kind that preside over a variety of things that have great impact on the human condition and how people see the world and interact with the world and cope with all sorts of misfortunes. Sadly, such belief systems have been greatly repressed and altered by world-denying views of patriarchal belief systems. And much has been lost to us, and humanity has been more concerned with death and what lies beyond, rather than facing life and enjoying life and trying to deal with the reality of life. Therefore, this is indeed the first problem we face. Colonialism has had a severe impact on several cultures and patriarchal systems of governance that have greatly repressed women's societies and therefore have repressed and even destroyed women's forms of interaction with life. But we shall see some examples further ahead, don't worry. So, let's finally delve into the main subject. I've been asked this before, if there are any pagan deities. More often than not, the question is focused on European deities. Pagan deities of miscarriage, stillborn, stillbirths, and if there is a specific afterlife place for them. An afterlife place for the fetus or for the stillborn, fully developed but born dead. I have to be careful with my next few words because I don't want to sound harsh, cold and even insensitive. If we look into communities in which shamanism is the basis of spirituality of such communities, and I'm using shamanism here as a general term, right? Well, the idea of an afterlife place for the fetus or the stillborn is often dismissed because of the belief that life only inhabits a body, or rather, life is only present within a body with the first breath, meaning nothing is truly alive without a spirit in it. And in the case of humans and concerning various shamanic communities, a spirit only inhabits the body of a human when the first breath is drawn. And from that moment, the baby is alive. So if the baby was never fully formed, or indeed if it's stillborn, there was never a spirit within and therefore never truly alive. So the spirit that would inhabit that baby will have to wait for the next opportunity, so to speak. We see this idea of the breath of life in many indigenous communities and still see the traces of this conception in some mythologies. The conception of Sila among the Inuit. Sila is the breath or spirit. It is the very essence that awakes life in something. Sila is the primary component of everything that exists and, therefore, it is alive because it possesses spirit or breath. Sila is given by the spirit of the sky, the wind and the weather. Sila is the very breath of the world, that is, air. It has been often assumed to be a male god, but as far as I was able to research, there's no actual gender attributed to this entity of the sky. We find similarities in Old Norse mythology, which I have spoken about several times. A sort of equivalent to the Inuit Sila is the Ond, which is breath or spirit. And it is this primary component that awakes life in everything. Ond is the gift Odin gives to the first humans, or rather the primary component matter receives. Lifeless bodies receive this gift from the gods, among other gifts that awaken life and compose life, so that matter may be alive and become the first humans. And one of the gifts or component is Ond, the breath or spirit given by Odin, who was associated with the sky, weather phenomenon and the winds before being introduced in Scandinavia in the migration period. So, we see the parallel here, and life is awakened by receiving the breath of the world, air, which is spirit. Of course, these conceptions and belief systems don't make it easy to cope with miscarriage and stillbirths, but it seems to not give a lot of room to deal with it and doesn't give a lot of answers, but at least we understand to a certain extent when and how something is understood to receive life and becomes alive. There's no shamanism without animism, so it's a question of an intricate web of spiritual entities. And if one spirit doesn't get the chance to inhabit a body, it will eventually have to wait for the next chance. It may not give us a lot of answers, but at least gives us an idea that not everything is truly lost, and that the case of miscarriage and stillbirths is something out of our control. Doesn't have to be for good or evil, doesn't have to have a meaning, but rather it just happens. And some things in life are out of our control. There's no reason, there's nothing to blame, and simply the spirit waits for the next opportunity. Of course, I'm speaking in religious and spiritual terms, and the case of goddesses and other entities that might be linked to this subject of miscarriage and stillbirths. What I said previously almost seems like such societies don't care much about these unfortunate occurrences in life, but that is not so. How people deal with this, socially and psychologically speaking, be that in community or privately, that's another matter. Historically speaking, concerning indigenous societies at least, women were often considered the center or the backbone of the community. The importance of giving birth, raising the children, providing education to the young ones. It was all a mothering process, which is still very well represented in many indigenous societies. It's a strong aspect of women's society and greatly praised, honored and respected. The problem we face here, both religiously speaking, but also within the social daily life of indigenous peoples, and I also very much include the ancient European indigenous past, well, the problem we face is colonization of cultures, the destruction of several ways of life, belief systems, religions, the colonization of mentalities. The very idea of motherhood, childbirth, the general factors that make the foundations of a women's society were colonized, and women lost much of their roles within several societies throughout the various processes of colonialism through time by the part of patriarchal societies. So this has a great impact on the goddesses and feminine figures within the belief systems of several cultures. As women are repressed by a patriarchal system, so will too goddesses and other aspects of the sacred feminine and everything that encompasses a woman's society and womanhood and eventually motherhood. So it's hard to find goddesses or any deity at all linked to aspects of life that are often associated to a woman's life and existence. There's still the tradition in many indigenous and also non-indigenous societies of the burial of fetal and or placental tissue after a miscarriage, which constitutes a symbolic event offering solace to the mother and family. I come from a village in Europe in which this was done. It was a tradition after miscarriage to bury the fetal or placental tissue by the roots of a tree, usually an oak tree, which is deemed to be sacred. And as far as I know, this act of burying the bodily tissues after miscarriage is also done by some First Nations Native American societies. The problem we are facing here is the colonization of these traditions as well. And soon we lose the more religious and spiritual aspects of it, even the symbolic ones. And it's hard to understand to which deities or other entities these traditions were associated with, right? We are dealing with post-mortem traditions that have been culturally inappropriate for the colonizers, so things were changed, forbidden, replaced. If we take into consideration that the colonizers were Christians, a body must go intact into the earth in order to be spiritually whole and be reborn again. So the traditional religiously and symbolic burial or cremation of parts of a body was inappropriate, even assumed to be savage, godless, even primitive, from the point of view of the colonizers, with different belief systems. So many beliefs and values were destroyed, forbidden, altered, and much has been lost, unfortunately. The colonization process of populations is one of the great reasons why we don't find much about how people from the past, mostly pre-colonial past, dealt with the topic we are dealing with today in this video. But there's another reason. One of the very strong beliefs indigenous, animistic and pagan societies have in common is the widespread understanding of Mother Nature as an entity who gives and takes life and does not discriminate, without making any distinctions who must die and who mustn't. So it is possible that in religious terms, and in the case of mythologies, we don't find a concrete answer to miscarriage, stillbirth and spontaneous abortion because it's an event felt as part of the cycle of life. And it may not have been as stressful for past civilizations to deal with this event because it was understood as part of life. It only became stressful for colonizers and the colonized because of the monotheistic belief systems that offer no real solace or any answer at all concerning these aspects of life. Because, again, Abrahamic belief systems are patriarchal structures that have highly repressed women's societies and womanhood. Little or no attention at all is given to such aspects of life because it's mostly always under the perspective of man and the social roles of man within patriarchal systems in which women have little to say or whose social roles have been repressed, ignored, forbidden and forgotten. Well, speaking of Europe, perhaps the only goddess related to the underworld and possibly to stillborn and or miscarriages would be �εκάτη. Of course, due to her association with both motherhood and death. Although, surprisingly, there is never anything mentioning the case of stillborn and or miscarriage. And that may be because in paganism there was the belief in rebirth or some form of reincarnation. In ancient Greece, especially within the religious mysticism of Orphism and the legalism of the Pythagorean doctrine, the belief in the transmigration of the soul. So there would not be a specific place for the stillborn as they had not become people among the living and so they would return in some other form or born again. This may also be due to a more ancient past and the shamanic belief that the spirits that make a person alive only enter the body with the first breath, the first cry of the baby. So not being born, the babies were not actually ever alive and with the spirits necessary to be alive. This might be one reason, of course, as previously said. One patron of mine pointed out something interesting concerning folk myths or folklore, to be more accurate, which is the case of feminine entities taking away babies and killing them and drinking their blood, often referred to as witches within European folk traditions. For example, the Greco-Roman folk creatures like Strixes or Strigis, sort of blood-sucking women who could turn into an owl-like creature and would take away a newborn baby and feast upon their flesh. The patron in question pointed out that behind these creatures there may be a true emotional state to help dealing with the psychological effects of losing children, which makes sense in a way. I'm not completely discarding this possibility. However, there's much more to it. But indeed, we must take into consideration the fact that past civilizations had to deal with a lot of untimely death of their children and several complications for both women and babies during childbirth. The folklore concerning owl-like women that come to snatch babies away is far older than the written sources speaking of such creatures. So there may be a sense of culpability implicit in here. Either women who need to blame someone else for having lost their child, or we are in the presence of men who blame their women for having lost the child. So there's actually a demonization of the feminine in order for men to cope with the loss of their children, blaming their wives for not being able to give them a son or an heir. We see this a lot up until the Middle Ages and in the modern period, especially among the nobility and the royalty, and how men often blame their wives for having been incapable of producing a male heir. So the demonization of women is very real here, as if they had done it on purpose and murdered a child to sabotage the male plans. However, the idea of owl-like women snatching and eating babies is often the demonization of feminine figures by patriarchal societies, which I have talked about before on another video. You can see right here. These owl-like creatures may actually have been benevolent women, witches, or even supernatural feminine entities that once had the function of precisely taking away the spirits or souls of the unborn or the stillborn and taking care of such spirits. And this took a whole other meaning when patriarchal systems of belief took hold of several ancient societies, especially noticeable in ancient Jewish, Greek and Roman societies of the classical period. And that's precisely how the figure of the witch was first created, by the demonization of powerful women and turned into blood-sucking creatures of the night, especially noticeable in the Greek figures of Circe, Medea, Lamia, as a child-eating monster who was once a very powerful queen of Libya, so she was demonized by the Greeks during the colonization process of ancient Libya. The very goddess �εκάτη, who became the goddess of witches, Lilith, the figure of Jewish mythology, who is portrayed as a promiscuous demon of the night who kidnapped children. So you get the point. But it's important to reflect a little longer on the figure of the Strix, the owl-like woman who kidnaps children and feasts upon their flesh. Folk tales report to an animistic past which is quite hard to reach the spiritual understandings behind them. Indeed, the Romans were afraid of owls, mostly because it was believed magic women, later labeled witches, would turn into owls. Hence the modern Italian name for witch, which is strega, from Latin strix, plural strigis or strixes, which is an owl, the spirit entity, a genus in the form of an owl as a bird of ill omen feeding on human flesh. but it's an ill omen, so not in a benevolent sense. I'm sure there might have been something more general in a religious past within animistic cultures about beings taking stillborn and protecting them somehow. Our most primordial ancestors were quite sensitive, but the Strix enters somewhat in the category of the Icelandic Grýla, a giantess who feeds upon the flesh of mischievous children or snatches away babies, just like Lilith of the Hebraic myths and Lamia from the Greeks, a vampiric-like woman who eats babies, but weren't originally that. Notice what the Strix, Grýla, Lilith and Lamia have in common: women who eat babies. Conceptions of patriarchal societies taking away the power of matriarchal cultures that came in contact with, in which women were linked to the priesthood and acted as spiritual leaders, shaman women, sorceresses, prophetesses. But for more information on this, check the video I have previously pointed out entitled Rise of the Witch. If you haven't watched that already, it might help you out where I explain this in more detail. But it is also important to reflect a little in the case of the witch woman and the eating of human flesh, especially of infants. This isn't solely related to the fact that children represent hope for the future and the continuation of a people, and therefore the killing of a child is a great crime against the human community whence the child belonged to. This also has to do with specific taboos within an animistic worldview. I'm using the term taboo here as a general term to refer to something forbidden and not necessarily the cultural meaning in Polynesian and oceanic cultures. I'm talking about cannibalism, which is taboo in many human communities, both from the past and the present, of course, and the inherent fear of bewitchment that can cause harm and even death to humans by magical means, or an entity magically manipulating humans in order to eat their flesh. The fear of being eaten. This fear has been very present in many indigenous societies, and it's also quite present in the figure of the witch in Europe during the late Middle Ages and modern period, as mostly magical women who killed others in uncanny ways in order to eat the flesh of their victims in communal feasts. This is a type of fear attested on a global scale. The fear of someone who uses magic in secret ways to cause harm, illness and even death. There may be indeed a certain trauma behind the image of the flying witch woman who kidnaps or eats babies as a form of placing blame in something or someone to cope with the loss of a child. And indeed, it may be a form of explanation for such an unreasonable act as the one of losing an innocent, and not only putting blame into something or someone, but also channeling guilt towards something else in order to shift oneself from pain and even madness. But in the figure of the flying witch woman, or the feminine semi-human creatures that snatch babies and eat them, it seems to be a global fear of bewitchment towards the human community and losing their most precious members, family members, once kin, especially children, as the loss of a child means the loss of a future and the continuation of a people, and therefore the continuation of a culture as a form of perpetuating the memory of a people. Returning to European goddesses, I think in the Celtic tradition we can find another reason why there are no specific deities or afterlife places for the stillborn, or even an explanation for miscarriage. In many regions in Europe where the Celtic cultural traditions have had a foothold, it has often been a common belief that people celebrated the death of someone dear to them and lamented birth. The belief behind this attitude was that the dead person would somewhat return home or would go to the place of the gods and ancestral spirits to live a better life than the one in this world. When a child was born, however, it was believed the spirit of a dead person will return from the spiritual world and come back into the world. So it was reason to lament, to grieve, because the spiritual world was better than this one, apparently. However, I have my doubts about this belief. The Celts were pagans and their religious understandings were very much pagan in nature. That is, world-accepting religious perspectives. And that is very well present in archaeological sources rather than written sources, because written accounts concerning the Celts are either from the perspective of Romans or Christians, or are romanticized accounts written more than 1,000 years after the Celts were gone. Not to mention the Celts were not a people, not an ethnic group, but a series of populations all across Europe and beyond, which became Celts by adopting a Celtic-like lifestyle. So much more to do with cultural roots rather than an ethnic background. Therefore, belief systems among the Celts or within the Celtic cultural world varied in many important points for each society. The religious understanding that the next world is better than the world of the living is an Abrahamic religious understanding, creating a clear detachment from life itself and focusing all life activities as a continuation, as a continuous preparation for the next world. So I have my doubts about this Celtic tradition, which might actually have been recorded by Christians, especially by Greco-Roman Christians of the early Middle Ages and by Irish monks. And the observance of such ritual traditions towards death was misunderstood by the Roman Christian compilers, especially by Roman and Greek still pagans, by classical civilizations of the late Iron Age, who had some contact with some Celtic cultural societies, but always a very detached and distant interaction with other populations and cultures. There was indeed celebration of death or in death among various Celtic tribes throughout Europe, but it was mostly when a chieftain, warlord, king, or some warlike figure of great renown, a cultural hero, died and a feast was held in his honor. Dancing, singing, music, ritualistic sacrifice, and even battle reenactment in which warriors actually died as sacrificial offerings to follow their leader into the next world. Another reason might be that the perception of an afterlife for stillborn might have been taken out by Christians to frighten pagans. If the parents aren't baptized, then they will never see their stillborn in the afterlife. In fact, during early Christianity in the Roman Empire, until the early Middle Ages, children were not baptized. Only adults were baptized, either when they came of age or at their deathbed. But when the idea of having to be baptized to enter heaven was created, people started to be baptized sooner than it used to be according to early Christian canons. Many parents were terrified that they would not see their children in heaven, because the tradition was to be baptized only when people became adults. So the church, during the early Middle Ages, around the 5th, 6th century, started to baptize babies as soon as they were born, because the parents demanded it so they could see their children again. The church might have taken this factor to their advantage to frighten pagan parents, to persuade them to be baptized and baptize their children, just in case their children will die in the womb, in case of miscarriage, stillborn, or untimely death of an infant before hitting puberty or being old enough to be allowed to be baptized. By baptizing the parents, the babies in the womb were safe, and if they died before being born, at least they would be safe and go to heaven due to the fact that the parents were baptized. This might be another explanation. If there was a pagan afterlife for stillborn, it might have been taken out from the written sources to force people to turn to the church that had the answer for the problem of miscarriage. I speak from experience, mind you. One of my greatest archaeological works was precisely in a context of religious transition between paganism and Christianity. And the work I was involved in was precisely the various architectonical changes of a place of worship turned into a church, and the various changes in the structure during the early Middle Ages to answer the fears and demands of the newly Christianized population. One of the earliest modifications was a baptismal font for babies that had never existed before. But it was a necessity to appease the fears of the newly converted parents and their grief of not meeting their children in the afterlife because the children had not been baptized, or they themselves had not been baptized the moment they had lost their children. Since I'm talking about the Celts, aside from Ἑκάτη, invoked and invoked by neo-pagans in relation to this subject of life and death, Caradwin is also called upon. But this is among neo-pagans, and we have nothing from the past about deities and or afterlife for stillborns. Bridget is another good choice, I think, a goddess of motherhood, childbirth and healing, among other things, of course. The goddess Bridget lost her son, although not stillborn or miscarriage, but it was her great grief, so she would be a goddess to turn to for these matters, I think. Which is somewhat similar to the Norse goddess Frigg, or Frigga, after she was introduced in Scandinavia in the Iron Age during the migration period. Frigg too lost her son, Balder, who was beloved by all the gods. So the loss of a child is also present in this goddess and the grief behind such an event. What does the Bible say about stillborns? Ecclesiastes chapter 6 verses 3 to 5. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. Psalm chapter 58 verse 8. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, like the stillborn child who never sees the sun. In other words, the stillborn child in the Bible is seen as something that never truly existed, and it is forgotten because it never had a name and thus never existed. And inexistence is understood to be better than those who live an unsatisfied life and have no burial. Not having a burial here denotes, or it is implicit according to this religious belief, a person who not only was poor in life, a vagabond, worthless, but also having no religion, barbaric, pagan, as in infidel and godless. We return to what was previously said about baptism. An unbaptized person is nothing in the eyes of Abrahamic beliefs, in the sense of not being recognized by God, therefore with no place in heaven in the afterlife. Hence the fear of newly converted pagan parents. What does archaeology say about it? In truth, little. There is a lot of talk about children as sacrificial offerings based on written sources, but this might be a misinterpretation from the part of ancient civilizations based on observance and ignorance towards other civilizations people came in contact with. We often read this concerning the Greeks and how they interpreted civilizations further east, especially Phoenicians, as they were both a military and economic power the Western Greeks constantly dealt with. So the Greeks portrayed them in very derogatory terms, often speaking about the sacrifice of children to the fire and to dark, strange gods. For instance, at Carthage, a large cemetery exists that combines the bodies of both very young children and small animals. And it has been argued that if the animals were sacrificed, then so too were the children. Recent archaeology, however, has produced a detailed breakdown of the ages of the burial of the buried children, and based on this, and especially on the presence of prenatal individuals, that is stillbirths, it is also argued that this site consists of burials of children who had died of natural causes in a society that had a high infant mortality rate, as Carthage is assumed to have had. Moreover, Greek, Roman and Israeli writers refer to Phoenician child sacrifice, as I pointed out. However, some historians have disputed this interpretation, suggesting instead that these were resting places for children miscarried or who died in infancy. The classical world and many other civilizations that came across or had any contact with Phoenicians, there was always a panorama of hatred towards them. Child sacrifice in this case might have been meant as slander. Child sacrifice existed in rituals, but it was not that often and not a widespread phenomenon. Most likely we are in the presence of burials for children who died too young and of natural causes, and burials for stillborn. This is in fact a problem from the point of view of archaeology. Most children in the archaeological record simply do not exist. Burials might be found, but nothing in them, which could be anything buried in there. Young children, especially before 6 years old, and especially babies, have their bones quite soft, not hardened yet, precisely to be flexible and help in the process of growth. In other words, the bones are not yet the hard matter we are familiar with, and more like a soft gelatin-like composition, which completely disappears after a couple of years. Bacteria and climate acting on the bones as if they were organic matter, easy to dissolve in the process of decomposition. Babies disappear in the archaeological record just a few years after their burials. Babies can only be found if they have been mummified or buried in conditions devoid of oxygen, like in bogs or permafrost or deep in layers of ice. I remember being precisely on the context of the early Middle Ages. The religious context was Christian, and there was the interesting habit of carving resting places on stones or large boulders or just granite floor, and it's usually an anthropomorphic shape carved on stone to place the body of the deceased and often covered with a shroud. Some of these burials on stone are of small size, clearly for children at a very young age, but nothing is found precisely because of the consistency of the bones at a young age in a body still in development. Pagans might not have had the need of a special afterlife place or deity for stillborn, since most pagans believed in rebirth in some way. But yes, �εκάτη seems the likely choice, perhaps even Artemis, due to some of her connections with the underworld, but also in some myths she is said to have played the role of midwife to her own mother and help her brother Apollo coming into the world. Although in other myths they are twins, but most myths seem to insist that Artemis was born first, regardless of being Apollo's twin or not. Artemis believed that she had been chosen by the fates to be a midwife, particularly since she had assisted her mother in the delivery of her twin brother Apollo. Perhaps even Frigg, as pointed out before, or Freya, the latter due to the connection with death and the afterlife, although the former being linked to children and motherhood. But nothing is mentioned of that in the sources. I'm just assuming due to the connection of these goddesses with death, children and motherhood. If we look into Egypt, perhaps we can say Nephthys, perhaps. Of all the things she was goddess of, she was also the goddess of mourning, childbirth, mothers, the dead, protection, the home, coffins and burials. Speaking of Egyptian goddesses, I think it would be interesting to mention the cult of Isis. Not so much on the Egyptian cultural context, but rather the impact of this goddess and her religion in European geographical context. Isis was an incredibly prominent figure whose cult actually threatened to extinguish early Christianity. This feminine entity was not only worshipped in Egypt, but also throughout the Roman Empire. And I mean all the Roman Empire. Isis comes to us in the myths and in the sources recording the religious beliefs around her figure, portrayed or presented as being the perfect mother and wife, and also a goddess of magic. Curiously, the magic associated to Isis wasn't the usual depictions of magical women across the classical civilizations, but instead Isis was portrayed as the idealized form of a magical woman, a devoted mother who used her great powers for good. When the Emperor Caligula showed his support towards the cult of Isis, the cult itself began to flourish across the empire. A religion surrounding Isis developed alongside Christianity. In fact, the portrayal of Isis as a heavenly mother with a prophesied son of kings influenced Christianity. The figure of the Virgin Mary has a considerable amount of cultural influences drawn from the religion of Isis across the Roman Empire. And it's actually curious to see that all across Europe, within the massive geographical areas of the former Roman Empire, the goddess Isis came to replace local mother goddesses. Mother goddess figures of several localities became Isis. And you know what has happened to those goddesses? After the religion of Isis came to an end and Christianity triumphed, that's right, those goddesses became the Virgin Mary. Cults to mother goddess figures were not entirely replaced or disappeared, but instead the images of these goddesses became Isis within the Roman Empire. And after the fall of the empire and the rise of a new one, Christianity, Isis was replaced in turn, and these goddesses became the Virgin Mary, often depicted breastfeeding or holding in her arms the infant Jesus. So Isis and any mother goddess figure replaced by her would be a good choice to turn to in cases of miscarriage and stillbirths. I've looked into other cultures and I would like to share a few with you. Just a quick view. Among the Turko-Tatars, it seems that goddesses have played a minor role in their religious life, and an Earth Mother figure entity is practically inexistent. Among the Yakut, there isn't at all an Earth Goddess figure. It is interesting to notice that it's not the absolute absence of goddess figures among Turko-Tatars and Siberian peoples. In truth, they know of several feminine divinities. The problem here is that their religious panorama is almost entirely governed by a patriarchal system, so the feminine divinities are often reserved for women and women alone. These divine feminine entities are concerned with childbirth and children's diseases. However, there's little we truly know about such goddesses, as they seem to be restricted to women's society, overshadowed by the patriarchal system of governance. And there's little place for these goddesses in the broader religious sphere of the Turko-Tatars and Siberian peoples. And this is noticeable in the general mythological role of women within these societies, which is considerably small, and we only often see the display of beliefs towards these goddesses within shamanic traditions. So it's rather difficult to perceive the role of women and the role of goddesses within these patriarchal structures, which actually tells us a thing or two about other cultures where goddesses play major roles, and there are large numbers of goddesses and feminine figures, which demonstrates an ancestral indigenous predisposition to have less patriarchal structure and perhaps more matriarchal, or indeed not a gender-related structure at all, and much more inclusive. I've also looked into pre-Islamic cultural contexts, although I must say there's little we can perceive from written sources and we must rely on archaeology. But as you can imagine, archaeology of pre-Islamic context is a great challenge, and very rarely any Muslim country wants to find out about their pagan past as to preserve the integrity of their monotheistic religion. But there are some vestiges nonetheless. The cultures of the Arabian Peninsula worshipped a number of deities before the coming of Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era. And perhaps one of the most important goddesses, not counting with Inanna, the ancient Mesopotamian goddess, later known as Ista by Akkadian, Babylonians and Assyrians. Well, one of the most important goddesses with an extensive cult was the goddess Al-Lat, greatly worshipped in West and Central Asia in pre-Islamic periods. But of course, she is now a shadowy figure and there's little we truly know of this goddess. But she was a very popular goddess in many regions of the Arab world. She was essentially a moon goddess, a bringer of fertility. She was a goddess of the earth and also related to love. Her symbol was the crescent moon. People often named their daughters after this goddess. There's little we know of her, as her cult ended after the Prophet Muhammad received the revelations of Islam. All pre-Islamic deities were considered false deities by then, and this goddess was also renounced and her shrine was destroyed. The Greeks, however, have compared this goddess to their Athena or to Aphrodite. There's also the great goddess of South Asia among the Hindu, Durga, who manifests herself in several forms, all of which are aspects of Mahadevi, the great goddess, who is the personification of Shakti, the feminine divine energy that is the very heart of creation. In fact, several goddesses are worshipped as forms of Durga. So perhaps the most gentle and caring form of Durga would be Parvati, the mother goddess. Parvati is essentially a benign goddess, although to what extent she can be of assistance concerning miscarriage and stillbirths, I'm not sure. Speaking of which, it reminds me of the sacred river. Of course, all rivers are sacred in Hinduism. However, the waters of Ganga are especially sacred and can wash away a person's past sins. And if a dead person's ashes are immersed in these waters, the soul is free from the undying cycle of death and rebirth. The river itself is worshipped as the goddess Ganga. She has had several children, but she drowned each one of them in the waters as soon as they were born, as she was destined to give birth to divine beings called Vasus, who were doomed to be born human. So by drowning them in the waters, she has released them from this curse. And this aspect of drowning her children in water reminds me precisely of miscarriage and death within the womb, within the waters of life, so to speak, which in many traditional folk beliefs, miscarriage and a sort of afterlife place for the stillborn is often spoken as unborn children returning to the lake or to the waters, or remaining in a sort of body of water. But I cannot delve too much on this because there's indeed little to explore here, and such folk beliefs are not widespread enough to draw any real conclusion. But in the myth of Ganga, killing her children, we see here the parallel with what was previously said of the witch woman who kills babies as a form of demonizing women from the part of men, demonizing their own wives and blaming them for the loss of their children and heirs. If we look into East Asia, mainly China, we come about the Queen of Heaven, also known as the Golden Mother of the West, Wangmu, which is one of the most powerful immortals. She is capable of bringing death or to grant eternal life to a person by allowing them to eat one of the peaches of immortality from her garden, much like the Norse goddess Idun, whose apples of immortality from her personal garden extend the life of the gods. Well, women often prayed to Wangmu for good fortune when they were about to be married. Marriage in traditional societies often means consummating the marriage with sexual intercourse between the couple and bringing forth life. So good fortune in the marriage life, I think it is to be assumed that also involves the protection of children in the womb. And since Wangmu is also capable of bringing death as well as granting eternal life, in her hands there's the fragile balance between life and death. She gives and she can take it away. A mother goddess, controller of life and death, you should perhaps look into. There are of course other cultures and goddesses, but I don't want to extend this too much. In fact, by the end of this video I'll leave a suggested video I've done in the past concerning the matron cult in Germanic context you might want to look into. But to finalize this video, I would like to make a reference to Native American traditions, and for this topic perhaps it is appropriate to speak about Changing Woman. Changing Woman is one of the most important female deities of the Navajo, who represents the earth and the stability of the cosmos. Some accounts point her to having produced the Navajo ancestors from her body. However, other accounts refer to her as either the daughter of the sky and the earth, or the offspring of first boy, thought, or first girl, speech. Changing Woman, if I'm not mistaken, and please correct me if I'm wrong, has this name because she can change from one stage of life to the next, from baby to girl to woman and to old woman, in an endless process of changing, ever changing and moving between the cycles of life of a woman. In other words, I think it's safe to say she represents womanhood and all the beauty, struggles, all the evolution of becoming a woman and being a woman. The cyclical changes of the seasons, just as the cyclical changes of a woman and a woman's identity. Concerning miscarriage and stillbirth, only nowadays among neo-pagans this has been addressed more intensely, precisely because of the lack of answers from the long-lasting Christian religious traditions in the West. Neo-pagans, to have some answers concerning this, naturally turn to goddesses who are associated with both death and childbirth. Miscarriage was, as it still is today, very much part of the realities of motherhood and parenthood. I think this is one of the reasons the figure of mother goddesses and many goddesses in general with a motherly side to them tend to have a slightly darker side. Certainly the darker aspects are related to the earth, the underworld. But that's the thing precisely. Earth goddesses are always related to death and are always motherly figures. The representation of the earth as a source, provider and sustainer of life, as well as accepting the dead into the underworld and the afterlife underworld realms of the earth, or the realms of the dead governed by a mother goddess figure, and the dead return to the womb of the earth to be reborn. I've presented this very idea on the video I have done about the cult of the dead in Old Norse religion. So perhaps various pagan beliefs towards stillborn and miscarriage might have been somehow around the perspective that babies would return to the earth to be reborn, just like everyone else. For a very long time there was in fact the tradition of the disposition or the deposition of the body in the burial mound in a fetal position. The idea of returning to the earth in death, the same way they had come into the world. So many goddess figures can be both cruel but also caring, the life-giving powers in their hands, the balance between life and death, birth and rebirth, returning to the earth, returning to the origins and being reborn from the womb of the earth, which is very well represented in the Neolithic burial mounds often associated to the cult of goddess figures. Even though there aren't a lot of references to miscarriage and stillbirths in mythological sources concerning various goddesses, this doesn't mean our ancestors were totally insensitive to these occurrences of life. Times change, the needs and worries and joys and fears of societies change, and with such changes of mentality, the gods also evolve. Why shouldn't they evolve? If the natural world itself evolves, and every life must accompany evolution, why wouldn't the gods themselves also evolve? It doesn't truly matter if there were no deities related to miscarriage and stillbirths, or if indeed such information is lost to us. What matters is what lies within our heads and within our hearts. Paganism has always been about evolution and the ability to accompany the changes of societies. We, as modern pagans, don't really have to live a pagan life aiming to reconstruct an entire past period. No one truly wants to live in the Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age, whatever period of human history seems more appealing. Those who really want to do that are usually people who have no idea what it was like back then and think that the modern comforts and privileges also existed back then. No one truly wants to do human sacrifices anymore. No one truly wants to die before they reached 30. No one truly wants to suffer injustice and lose their home and family just because of past superstitions. And this or that person thought it would be a good idea to kill this individual or that individual because it would please the gods, or struggling to find food and clean water. We have evolved, and the gods have evolved with us. So it doesn't truly matter if we can't find a deity of this or that. What matters is that the gods evolve with us, and as such they become gods of something else. Or another field of expertise is added to a specific deity because that's what we need right now. The blessings of the gods are endless. We don't have to limit ourselves to specific patterns. The gods have evolved in the past and more characteristics and powers added to them according to the needs of humans. So why should we stop now? Whatever are your struggles, know that some things are beyond your powers and there's nothing you can do about it. Know that not everything needs a reason. In truth, the idea of life and being alive needing to have a reason and purpose is something we rarely see or find in indigenous societies, especially animistic ones. Calm down. You don't need a reason to validate your existence and to be human. You and me, like every living being on this earth, we are all meant to do the same. We are meant to live. We are meant to be beautiful. We are meant to be unique. We are meant to feel everything that life has to offer and be immersed within everything that encompasses life. There's no need for a reason. Being alive, you are already valid. Some things happen that are beyond our control. Cry and scream as much as you have to, and release the pain within your chest and heal your spirit, but never forget to live. Live for you and for those who are still around and care about you. The troubles of the dead won't trouble them no more. It's with life that you must concern yourself with, and with those who strengthen your spirit and encourage you to be whoever you want to be. Be unique, be wild and fierce, be beautiful and live for as long as you can and for as long as it is possible. The gods are with you and within you, and all the answers shall be found. We are all in this together, and we should indeed help each other as best as possible and try to minimize as much damage and harm as possible in order to enjoy life. We all make a difference when we help someone else. It costs nothing to be kind. Remember that. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thanks for today.